Hello there, good afternoon, and a very warm welcome to this latest edition of Euronews Debates. This time, focusing on the EU's Green Deal and brought to you in partnership with ERT. That's the European Roundtable for Industry. So it's an absolute pleasure today to sit down, virtually of course, with the chairs and CEOs of some of the biggest and oldest companies in the world from the industrial and technological sector. And also with the EU's Mr. Climate Change himself, that is the Vice President of the European Commission, Frans Timmermans. Frans Timmermans is a well-known Dutch politician and he's currently one of the most powerful people in Brussels, if you like, when it comes to the EU Green Deal. He was the man put in charge of the signature policy of Ursula von der Leyen. So joining us today from Athens is Dimitri Papalexopoulos. Dimitri Papalexopoulos is the Vice Chair of the European Roundtable for Industry and he's also the Chairman of the Executive Committee of Titan Cement Group. We also have Helge Lund. Helge Lund is a Norwegian businessman and he's the Chairman of BP since January 2019. That's of course the British oil and gas multinational that's headquartered in London. And then we move over to Copenhagen and say hello to Jim Snabe. Jim Snabe is a Danish businessman and he's currently the Chairman of Siemens and Maersk. That's the Danish shipping company. Now, Jim also lectures at Copenhagen Business School in Leadership, Responsible Business and Change Management. And he's also a member of the Board of Trustees at the World Economic Forum. And now we head to Stuttgart in Germany, where Ola Källenius is standing by. Ola Källenius is a Swedish businessman. He started his career, in fact, back at Daimler-Benz in 1993 as a trainee. And now, today in 2021, he's the chairman of the Board of Management of Daimler and he's the head of Mercedes-Benz. And joining us now from Brussels, from Belgium, where I am as well, is Ilham Kadri. Ilham Kadri is a French-Moroccan businesswoman with a background in science. She's currently the CEO of the Belgian chemical company Solvay. And according to Fortune magazine, she's one of the most powerful business leaders in the world. Ilham Kadri, it's great to have you with us. How does it feel to be the only woman on today's panel?
I feel good, Maeve. Thank you for having me and greeting from Brussels. Very glad to be with you today.
And then, last but not of course least, we head over to sunny Spain, to Madrid, to say hello to Ignacio Galan. Ignacio Galan is a Spanish businessman and an engineer who is the CEO of Iberdrola since 2001. That is, of course, the global energy company that supplies energy to 100 million people worldwide. And according to the Financial Times, Mr. Galan was responsible for transforming Iberdrola from a domestic company with coal, nuclear and oil-fired power plants into the third biggest utility in the world and a clean energy specialist. So now we have gotten to know our panellists and now let's hear what they have to say. So I'd like to invite Dimitri Papalexopoulos, that is the Vice Chair of ERT, to elaborate a little bit more on ERT's plans towards climate neutrality. Dimitri, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Maeve. Let me say clearly up front that we fully endorse, as ERT, the Commission's ambition to make Europe the world's first climate-neutral continent by 2050. One central idea is that of complementing the overarching climate policy with an ambitious industrial strategy that boosts European competitiveness and an equally ambitious energy transition strategy that ensures energy security, affordability, and fairness. Think of it as a golden triangle with climate at the top and competitiveness and energy at the base. A number of policy choices flow from that. That we need to put a price on all carbon emissions while maintaining a level playing field with the rest of the world. And that we recognize that not everyone will be a winner, and we must effectively support those individuals, those regions, those sectors who will be facing an uphill battle so that no one is left behind.
Well, thank you so much for those introductory remarks, Dimitri. I'd now like to bring in Frans Timmermans. He's, of course, the Vice President of the European Commission. So, Frans Timmermans, what would your message today be to ERT after you've heard their introductory comments?
We have this unique opportunity to do a lot of things in one go. Fortunately, our leaders have been able to agree on mobilizing 1.8 trillion for the recovery after to face the economic consequences of the pandemic. And we have this unique opportunity to use the European Green Deal as the principle along which we will do this restructuring and investment in recovery. It is incredibly important because we are borrowing from the future, in fact, now to recover. If we invest this in the right way, in the economy of the future, if we decarbonize our economy, if we switch to renewable energy, if we use the positive effects of the Industrial Revolution for the whole of society, then the investments we will be doing in the next couple of years will have huge returns. And then we can proudly say to our children and grandchildren, look, we fixed this just in time. We were much too late coming to the party, but we were just in time to set things on the right course.
Well, let's move on now to Helge Lund from BP. Helge, economists have said that the best and the only way perhaps to reduce carbon emissions is to put a price on them. What would you have to say about carbon pricing and how should it be used?
At its most simple, carbon pricing means that those who emit carbon should pay a price for that carbon. And at its best, it's effective because it incentivizes cleaner choices. It is efficient as it harnesses market forces. And it's also fair. Those who emit the most carbon pay the highest price. The good news is that 45% of Europe's emissions are already covered by carbon pricing. We need to reach 100%. It would be a tragedy if Europe's businesses committed to change, only to be undercut by those operating more cheaply in places where there is no carbon price. It would cost Europe jobs, but worse, it could lead to an increase in emissions as businesses relocate to places without the same environmental protections as in Europe. A big part of the answer is a carbon border adjustment. It means that anyone supplying carbon-intensive goods to Europe should also pay a carbon price, just like companies operating within Europe.
Thank you, Helge. And there are, of course, plans. The European Commission are planning to come out with a proposal on that carbon border adjustment mechanism. But now we can move on and hear from Jim Snabe, the chairman of Siemens and Merckx. Do you have already the technologies available to achieve this carbon neutrality?
COVID has locked countries down. And as a consequence, we have actually reduced emissions by 8% in 2020. So if anything, COVID has demonstrated that it's possible, even if a global lockdown clearly is not the right solution to this problem. So what is the solution? Well, I believe it's technology. And I am convinced that we are at an inflection point when it comes to sustainable technology. But how do we accelerate the adoption? And again, I think we have an inflection point. I mean, companies are now investing in climate-friendly solutions, not to be philanthropic. It has become good business to reduce emissions. Investors are investing in ESG-oriented companies because climate-friendly companies deliver a higher return at a lower risk, and consumers are beginning to vote with their spending. But I don't think that's enough, and that's why this discussion is so important. We also need the policymakers to help accelerate the adoption.
Thank you, Jim Snabe, for those opening remarks. And I'm sure if it wasn't for COVID-19, the Friday for Futures marches would very much be vividly happening on the streets, because they're happening still very much online, with a lot of pressure on all of you and on, of course, regulators and on EU member states to do their bit. But for now, we can move on now to Ola Kalinius from Daimler. I guess the goals for reducing emissions of greenhouse gases in the Paris Agreement require a lot of the mobile sector. So what can you tell us about consumer demand when it comes to CO2 neutral mobility? What needs to be done?
I would like to talk about the most powerful allies for our common vision towards climate and CO2 neutrality, the consumers, because they will in a large way determine whether CO2 neutral products, technologies, and ultimately then the Green Deal succeed or fail. Three things are at the top of the list to bring consumers with us on this journey. First, of course, attractive and affordable products. And global effort is underway to build a battery, lithium ion, and hydrogen industrial system. At the moment, it's not fully competitive with the cost of carbon-based fuels, and it's our job to try to close that gap. Second, we need to improve e-mobility convenience, especially in terms of infrastructure. The European auto industry has a clear technology path to achieve CO2 neutrality. That's a course that's been set. But the charging infrastructure build-out lags behind. It's not sufficiently coordinated. It differs greatly by region and cannot be solved in the first go by just market mechanism alone. What we need is a comprehensive electric charging and selective hydrogen refueling infrastructure across the entire EU by 2030. And to have a net positive impact on the environment, this infrastructure needs to be, of course, powered by green energy. And third, it was touched upon before, we need fairness in the governance of the transformation. And that means establishing a consistent political framework with reliable long-term goals and guidelines.
A complex task indeed, but you're confident that you can achieve it. Well, let's now hear from Ilham Kadri. She is the CEO of Solvay and she's based right here in Brussels. And you tell us, what does the Green Deal mean in general for European industry? How do you think it'll survive and, of course, prosper? Because that's what it is all about as well.
In fact, we will not achieve climate neutrality in Europe without significantly lowering the current level of CO2 emissions and further improving our production processes to decrease the carbon footprint, as industries have been labelled as part of the problem, but we are part of the solution. And this, in fact, involves substantial investments from which public and private funding is necessary to remain competitive. And my second point, Europe should become the best place to innovate for industry if we want to create jobs and geopolitical strategic value chain in Europe. Therefore, delivering the EU Green Deal should go hands in hand with an attractive Europe for investment and innovation. And the climate and digital transition imply huge costs. As industry, we need to invest in those new energies and in upskilling its people. And all this to take place under these difficult economic conditions. We have an economy which needs to be repaired and heavy international pressure. And we acknowledge that the level of financial support, as it has been said, has been upgraded during the COVID crisis to save the economy and repair it if well deployed by the member of states. So for innovation to flourish, our industry expects regulatory environment, and we need to continue encouraging investors to invest in companies with the will to change, to move from high-intense energy to cleaner ones, walk the talk, because we need these capital inflows. They are indispensable to achieve together the Green Deal, which is good for the people, the planet, and the pocket.
OK, thanks Ilham Kadri for those remarks. And now we can head over to Madrid and hear from Ignacio Galan, the CEO of Iberdrola, and ask him really about how this energy transition can be effective and, of course, fair, a big word that we've heard as well there from Ilham Kadri.
We need to be fast. Everybody's already mentioning the same thing. The time is now. We have the technology and the funding. The Next Generation EU program will be crucial to accelerate transition, and it will create incentive for private investment as well. We must benefit from these billions or trillions that are going to be invested in energy transition globally. The transition is necessary because taking care of the planet is a moral obligation. We need to leave a better world to future generations. But now we do not have to choose between cost and environment. We can have both.
Thank you, Ignacio Galan. And now I'd like to bring in again the Executive Vice President of the European Commission, Frans Timmermans.
We estimated that we would need at least 350 billion euros annually extra to make this transformation happen. So indeed, capital markets are ready and many investors are ready. But we're talking about dimensions that we haven't seen before. And indeed, in relatively short period of time, this money needs to be mobilized. And what we can do is to create the right legislative framework to make sure that we have this climate law in place that would discipline member states to do the right things, that we offer full transparency in preparing legislation, whether it's on emissions, whether it's on strengthening the emissions trading system, etc. Full transparency, and then we become predictable and we stay consistent over the next decade in sticking to the framework, so that we create a predictable environment for investors, but also for industries that need to invest in the new technologies, and they need some time. If you take the car industry, for instance, you need a couple of years to restruct to be able to deliver the new technologies of the future.
Now we can move on with a question from Youth and Environment Europe.
Hi, my name is Elisha Vinkel and I'm the Liaison Officer on Climate Change for Youth and Environment Europe, the largest independent European network of youth environmental organisations. For us, although at times it could be more ambitious, the European Green Deal is proof that the climate and biodiversity crises finally get the attention they require. Our question is the following. How are you going to make sure that in the end it's not the consumer, the people that rely on your products for lack of affordable and sustainable alternatives, that will pick up the tab for pollution caused by your activities? Okay, who would like to tackle that question? Perhaps Jim Snaby?
First of all, we need to understand that we are at that tipping point, which I talked about, which makes sustainable technologies not more expensive, but actually cheaper. So they're not only more sustainable, they're also cheaper and potentially better. And that's always the case. There is a price curve. The wind turbine example is a good one. Europe started early to invest. At the time, it was all based on public funding. And nowadays, there is no funding to any wind turbine project that is at least respecting itself. And so you see the price curves come down on these technologies, and that's why I talked about the inflection point. The question that was asked was, how do we make sure that the youth does not pay the bill for the pollution we make? And the only way we can do that as companies is to have very ambitious plans to become carbon neutral.
Let's bring in another question. This one is from Generation Climate Europe.
My name is Michel Steeds and I'm the coordinator of the Biodiversity Working Group at Generation Climate Europe, Europe's largest coalition of environmental youth-led organizations. The Green Deal is important to us as young Europeans, since climate neutral and nature positive policies will be decisive to ensure we can live on a healthy planet. Thus our question. How will you integrate risks related to business impacts and dependencies on nature in your corporate strategy and reporting? And how will you address activities upstream and downstream in your supply chains that drive climate change and environmental degradation?
We've put an ambition as an industry. We have signed up to construction, carbon neutral construction by 2050. And all the technologies, contrary to other areas, all the technologies are not there yet. The economics are not there. All the technologies are not there. But there has been, over the last few years, a big change in mindset from a purely defensive one, and how do we limit the damage, to one that has more along the lines of how do we accelerate the transition, how do we become more innovative, how do we get close to the customer, and how do we move this much faster. And that's where I think it's very important to come back to something that Helge Lund said earlier. This is not just about the winners, it's also about the companies that want to become greener or are trying to become greener, and how do we support these to get there faster.
But let's move on, because we've got lots of questions to get through. Now I've got one from Tony from Croatia. So, hello everyone, we're talking about the EU Green Deal, European businesses and European consumers. That's great, says Tony. But climate change is borderless. He says you might have a perfectly sustainable business in Greece, but a completely polluting factory next door in Turkey. His question is, how can government and the private sector convince and recruit those outside the European Union?
We as Europeans are responsible for about 8% of global emissions. So everything we do is only going to be successful on a global scale if others follow suit. Now, the good news is that in the last couple of months, we've seen a speeding up of commitments from others. China committing to carbon neutrality by 2060, Japan, South Korea, climate neutral by 2050. Some others have followed, South Africa as well. And now, of course, with the Biden administration in the US giving a completely new dynamic to the climate agenda, especially leading up to the global conference we will be having in November in Glasgow. But especially for Europe, what is especially important, that's why the question is so relevant. How are we going to convince and help our immediate neighbors to move in the same direction? We need to help our immediate neighbors as far as we can to be part of the European plans for what we're doing with energy. They're interested in that. Our investment in clean energy generation in our immediate neighborhood is very important. The general point that we need to convince others in the world to do the same is extremely relevant.
Okay, well, I have a question now from Julia from Rimini. She says, ciao tutti, and she says, when I go to the market, the organic products are always much more expensive than the rest. Sometimes the difference with regular products is just ridiculous. We need to lower these prices ASAP, but how, she says, can we do this?
We need to try and convince our farmers across the European Union with support, with technological innovation, with a lot of money, that there is a huge future in an agriculture that needs less pesticides, needs less fertilizers, is more in sync with our natural environment, is not a threat to biodiversity. And organic farming is one of the answers in that. It's not the only answer, but it's one of the answers. And that's why we're encouraging now member states to adopt a reformed common agricultural policy that would allow for more so-called eco schemes, that would allow for more support for farmers who want to move to a production which is no longer harmful to our environment. If we increase the level of production, if we increase the level of transformation, then obviously there will be much more offer on the market, and then the prices will go down. And apart from that, I think we also need to look at fiscal instruments to make sure that the price difference between food that is produced in a completely unsustainable way and food that is produced in a sustainable way is reduced. Taxation will have to play a role in that.
Thanks, Executive Vice President Frans Timmermans there. Dimitri Papalexopoulos, did you want to bring in your point there, mention something?
Well, the one thing I wanted to note is that there is no one-size-fits-all solutions. And beyond some overarching policies that we talked about, we have to get specific with complex solutions to complex problems. So food, buildings, cars or mobility, cement and steel, they all have to have different approaches. And we can't pretend that we have a silver bullet to address everything.
My name's Erica Hope, and I'm the Director for Climate Planning Indoors at the European Climate Foundation. In its position on the European climate law, the European Parliament proposes that the European Commission should prepare sectoral decarbonisation roadmaps. In principle, these roadmaps could help to mobilise investment in the needed industrial ecosystems, engage stakeholders, and also ensure an integrated approach to decarbonisation across the economy. What role could you see for these roadmaps playing for your sector? And what would you want the Commission to pay attention to in the way that they prepare them?
I think I already tackled it in the sense that we agree that there should be sector-specific approaches to many problems that cannot be solved with overarching policies. So it's fully in agreement with what is implied by the question.
Sure. Well, let's move on. I have another question here, because we talked a lot about hydrogen. We've heard a lot about the future of hydrogen during the last hour and a half. And there's a question here about Airbus, that they want to, of course, build the first hydrogen commercial airplane to be ready by 2035. And the question is, what if their big bet fails? Who would like to answer that? Yeah.
We all want to answer that. Is my impression. But again, there isn't a silver bullet in any sector, and air transportation will remain extremely important for our economy, and also in terms of the social importance of it. So we need to make sure that we reduce the carbon footprint. Now, given global developments, I think it's looking better than a couple of years ago. The Chinese and the Americans and others moving in that direction. But it's not just about hydrogen fuel planes. It's also about a different sorts of fuel that could be used, synthetic fuels that have a future, using biofuels to some extent. So we have to look at it from many angles. There's not one silver bullet, but there are ways of decarbonizing also air transport. But let's be clear: you cannot have electric planes, well, small ones, but not that will not provide for the real solution. So you need other solutions.
We have a long list of questions there. I'd like to invite perhaps Dimitri Papalexopoulos on behalf of the ERT, maybe just give a couple of seconds to round off and see what you take away, really, take home from this debate.
Let me finish by saying there are no simple solutions, but human ingenuity can achieve anything, and we can certainly achieve this ambitious goal.
And Executive Vice President Frans Timmermans, would you like to make a final remark there as well?
And the one thing that has encouraged me is that in the middle of this pandemic, people were surviving in survival mode, their health, their jobs, their families, and still more than 70% of Europeans want us to do something about the climate crisis. If that is not an incentive, I don't know what is. So let's get cracking.
Thank you so much. And thank you to you for watching. Thank you for all your comments. I hope we can keep this debate alive online. And let's do this again when COVID arrives, but let's do it physically. Let's get a live audience of people, from young activists to farmers and miners, to sit and have this conversation together. But for now, thank you so much and enjoy the rest of your day.